I wanted him to introduce me. I said, no, I got this. So first thing I want to say is thank you for being here. Thank you for being community builders. Thank you for being mentors, trip leaders, volunteers, really people that want to help this community of Austin and the youth in this community be fully engaged with life, right? When I see you outside in the sunshine, laughing together, connecting, it directly relates to this presentation, right? Because what you're doing out there is about mental health and well-being. And we're having like a lot of flickering happening.
I'll try and sort it.
Oh, you're trying to, okay. So I'm Christine Norton. I am an associate professor at Texas State University in the School of Social Work. I have a long history of playing silly games outdoors. I've known Fred and Noelle for about 20 years through the Association for Experiential Education. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I'm also a certified clinical trauma professional, and I'm also a certified experiential therapist. So I take mental health, and I take all that silly stuff, and I combine them, because it sure beats just sitting in an office talking about your problems. I don't have an axe to grind with talk therapy at all. However, we know all of the benefits of being in nature. There are just physical and mental health benefits that we are starting to see that are really, really profound. We also know the benefits of social connectedness, right? Loneliness and isolation are sort of the two things that really fuel mental illness, right? All of us can struggle with our mental health, and yet when we have a community of support, it is a huge protective factor. So that's sort of what drives me and my passion. I'm also a researcher. So I am a research scientist for the Outdoor Behavioral Healthcare Center, which is based out of the University of New Hampshire. And they have at UNH a dual degree program in a master's in social work and a master's in outdoor education. And so again, this is sort of a national, actually an international movement to combine being outside with mental health and well-being. So this presentation is going to be quick, rapid fire, skim the surface. I just want to own that, right? Because we have about 45, 50 minutes together. And what's going to be lacking, and I told James and Kathleen this, is the experiential piece. And so what you'll want more of at the end of this is like, oh, can we practice? Can we do role plays? Can we do scenarios? Not today. So if y'all, again, I've told these guys I would be happy to come back and do that. So I also want to just back up for a second and just sort of own my pronouns are she, her, hers. I try to do that when I introduce myself because, again, one of the most important things we can do is create a community that's radically inclusive. That, to me, is really, really good for all of our mental health because it means who you are fully and completely can walk through that door and be seated at this table. And that's what you want to create for your young people at Explore Austin, right? Is that sense of absolute inclusiveness. So we'll keep moving. So this is what we're going to be doing. So the very first thing is create a caring community in which mental health disorders are not stigmatized. Well, y'all are already doing all the work about creating a caring community. I saw it happening out there. The other piece of that is just that if you know the research about mental health, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 Americans have been diagnosed with a mental health disorder. Depends on the study that you look at. So that means there are those of us in this room, right, that have struggled with depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, an eating disorder, all kinds of things, right? Part of that is that, and I've been talking to my international colleagues about this, what is up with America, right? We have such a broken behavioral healthcare system, and then we have the highest rates of involuntary mental health treatment in the world. And like international colleagues is like, well, that's because you don't do prevention, right? And so we sort of have a sick society, and then we wait until we as individuals take on the symptomology of our sick society, and then we get a label, and then we get pathologized as mentally ill, right? So backing up that train, I just want to say what you all are doing is mental health prevention. That's exactly what you're doing. You're giving these kids experiences that are good for their physical and emotional well-being in a way that can serve as a protective factor. That being said, one of the biggest problems in mental health is stigma, right? Because it's not the fact that I had postpartum depression after I had my first daughter, which I did. It's the fact that I was ashamed about it. And I felt like a terrible mother and a terrible human. That's actually what fuels illness, not the fact that I cried every day for 6 hours. You know, sort of sucked. I read a lot of Walt Whitman. I don't know why I thought that would help. And he's dark, you know. I was like, but it's so like beautiful nature. No. Anyway, so we got to destigmatize it. So we'll just keep going through the list here. But first, I want to put it in the context of the mission, which is through a leadership-based outdoor adventure curriculum coupled with social and emotional learning components and long-term mentoring. That's you. Explore Austin is improving the well-being of each participant, their families, and the community. This is not an individualistic model. This is about community resilience, community well-being, right? And I think that's really important. So the question that I have is, can we accomplish this mission and ignore mental health? No, the answer is no. Please speak into your microphone. The representative from Sweden. This is like the UN up in here. So y'all take kids backpacking. How many of you have been on a trail? It doesn't have to be backpacking, but you're on a trail, right? What do you do when someone has a hot spot? You know, the pre-blister phase. What do you do? Just keep moving. Just keep going. Ignore that shit. Just go. What do? You stop. You address it before it becomes a problem, right? And this is what we have to start doing with our mental health as well, right? So we need to know what are sort of our red flags, or when we're out of balance, right? That's a good way of framing it with kids, with families, with each other. How do you know when you're sort of getting out of balance, right? So don't ignore the hot spot. What is mental health? Well, this definition says that mental health is a state of well-being in which individuals, I would add, and communities realize their potential, cope with normal stresses, work productively, and contribute to the community, right? So it's about being aware of our strengths, and it's about being able to contribute, right? A lot of times our mental health system is really paternalistic, like, we're going to fix you, okay? And really it's like, no, we're going to get you back on your feet, strong in yourself, because we need you. This community of Austin, Texas needs these young people. If these young people are not full contributors, then that's wasted social capital, right? So that's why we're focusing on mental health. And same with you all. I mean, this training is as much for you to think about your own mental health as it is for how you'll interact with these young people, okay? So mental health is a continuum, right? You're not either healthy or not healthy. I mean, all of us are vulnerable. That is the absolute truth. And we have life stressors, we have physical illness, we have death in the family, we have all these things that can really, our hormones change, hello. You know, we have all these things happening in our lives that affect our mental health. So one of the things that I want to point out is that 50% of all mental health disorders begin by the age of 14. What we know about the adolescent brain, right, is it is this time of rapid neural development. 0 to 3, rapid neural development. Again in adolescence, rapid neural development. And so there are some vulnerabilities there neurologically that happen for people. And that is why having the external supports of loving relationships and a healthy community while the brain is doing this dance is really, really important. Okay? And then 75% of all mental health disorders appear by the age of 24. So this is an issue for youth and young adults. Really. When we start seeing the onset of mental health, it's around this time of vulnerable development, which means we really have to think critically about what support people need. It also means that we need to think about mental health recovery. If it's a continuum, that means you can move back and forth. It doesn't mean that once you've been diagnosed with major depressive disorder that you are forever going to be mentally ill, right? You may have times of greater vulnerability and lesser vulnerability around your depressive symptoms, right? So what supports do you need? What supports do your youth need? I don't know where I'm clicking. Okay, so how common are mental health disorders. We talked about this. 1 in 5, again, 1 in 4, depending on the study, of adults have a mental disorder in any 1 year in the United States. Top 3. Not shocking, right? Anxiety, depression, substance abuse. Makes sense. I mean, and I always joke, like, if you're not a little depressed or anxious, you're not paying attention. You know? I mean, again, like, the world we live in is a little dicey right now. And we're bombarded, right? Constantly. We all have that little thing in our hands all the time. And so do our youth, right? And so that's a whole other issue that's sort of fueling and exacerbating some of the mental health stuff we're seeing. And then 1 in 5 children ages 13 to 18 have or will have a serious mental illness. Again, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and then conduct disorders, right? Some of those acting out, more aggressive, oppositional, defiant behaviors that we might see. So the impact of mental health problems, it's incredible. It's the #1 disability globally, followed by cardiovascular disease and neoplasms, which are like brain issues. Of the different mental health disorders, depression is the single biggest burden. And this is like an economic sort of stat where they look at missed days of work in school, and depression is the biggest issue. So we're dealing. It's a serious. Right now, I would say have a mental health epidemic in this country. I don't know if you're aware, but the rates of youth suicide are increasing. The rates of suicide for women my age actually are increasing. And so for a while, we felt like we were sort of making a dent as mental health professionals. And right now, we're seeing sort of a crisis wave of suicidality and depression and anxiety. I work on a college campus, and our college counseling center cannot keep up. Literally, I think you get 3 sessions because they're just like, next. You know, it's really, really wild. So I think all of us have to sort of think about, like, what is happening? And what are these pressures of the modern world that are just bearing down on all of us all the time? I mean, when's the last time y'all went out and just got to be kids, played some silly games in the sunshine? You know, and maybe you felt like a little self-conscious, like, oh, this is goofy, but then there was a party that was like, right? And so we have to give ourselves that time. So again, what you're doing with these youth is prevention. So, what's the cause of mental health disorders? Just say airplane, right? It's really like it's a lot. It's genetics, it's nature, and it's nurture, right? There's so much going on. Biology. We also know, and you've probably heard this, the relationship between mental health and trauma is insane. Like the correlation there. And so, how many of you heard the ACE study? Okay, ACE study is Adverse Childhood Experiences. Write it down, Google it, ACE study. Basically, it just shows the prevalence of trauma among just the general population. If I were to give out, you can actually go and take their little test and see what your own ACE score is, right? Some of us have pretty high ACE scores. That's why we got into mental health, you know. And so it's really important to understand that relationship between trauma and mental health. And my guess is that given some of the vulnerabilities of the young people that you work with and the marginalized communities that some of them are coming from, that they might have some higher ACE scores. So a lot of this also is really being sensitive to the role that trauma plays, psychosocial stress, poverty, and oppression, right? This idea of communities of color who have had to deal with intergenerational racism and to not consider how that affects their mental health is insane. You know, the legacies of genocide and slavery that this country sort of refuses to talk about, it's making a lot of people really sick. And I would argue that it's making, like, white men sick too, right? That the burden of violence and all of the legacy of that that's passed down, and you can't interrupt that toxic masculinity, it's making us sick, right? So there are these big macro level things and then more micro level things. But what we know is that our DNA is affected by our environment, right? There's this adaptive relationship happening between person and environment all the time. So the healthier our communities, the more likely we are to be healthy individuals, right? I just read, you guys know Chris McDougall, he's the ultra runner, he wrote Born to Run, and he just has a new book out called Running with Sherman. It's about him racing with this donkey. It's fabulous. It's so insane. But he talks about that, you know, he just talks about like this idea about, you know, getting outside and being healthy, and he lives among the Amish. He lives in like Amish country, in Pennsylvania Dutch country, and I knew nothing about the Amish, but he talks about how healthy they are. Like their lowest rates of mental health, lowest rates of suicide, like huge community, support system, and yeah, it was fascinating to sort of learn about. So that's a little reading assignment for you, running the show. Common misperceptions. Mental health disorders are signs of weakness, right? If you ignore the problem, it will go away. Hot spot, don't ignore it. Healthy people are not affected by mental illness. Not true. Okay? All individuals respond to the same treatment, if only, right? It would be so nice. But we're all individuals, and yet we do have some kind of cookie-cutter approaches to mental health. So these are some myths that I like to just bring up. So what are the common mental health disorders, right? We talked about this. Depression, anxiety, substance abuse. ADHD is probably something that you will see with the young people that you're working with. Oppositional defiant conduct disorders, eating disorders, and then psychosis. Psychosis sort of being a big umbrella term for psychotic disorders, where people actually begin sort of losing touch with reality, either because they're experiencing auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations, sort of a psychotic break. Amazingly, we get really freaked out. There are certain disorders. Bipolar disorder is not up there. Probably should have put it up there, but there are certain disorders that we get really freaked out about, and we think, oh, those people are dangerous. And what's hilarious is, in fact, even for people who have auditory or visual hallucinations, psychosocial peer support makes more of a difference than medication. So there are these groups, it started in the UK, called Hearing Voices, and it's just for people that have auditory hallucinations. So we would get together and be like, yeah, I hear voices. Do you hear voices? Yeah, I do. God, it's scary, right? God, it's so scary. What do your voices tell you? And sometimes mine tell me really terrible things. Like they describe me. I feel to hurt myself or hurt someone else. I know, mine too. So they study this process. And just by having that community of peer support and finding someone else that's struggling in the same way, their psychotic symptoms have totally decreased. Amazing. So something like that blows my mind. And I share that with you because I think it's directly related to what you're doing as mentors. Not necessarily around hearing voices, right? But around normalizing, empathizing, creating a community of support. All of that is mental health prevention. So pretty important. So let's talk about this sort of spectrum of interventions. We talked about the fact that Explore Austin is definitely in the prevention category. You all are not expected to be therapists. Some of you, are any of you actually licensed mental health professionals? Okay, awesome. Just one. Because that definitely happens, right? Where we have volunteers. Are you a mentor or a trip leader? Or?
Mentor.
Okay, great. So she will be your resource. What's your discipline? Are you a social worker? Or
I'm at LPCI right now.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Very
Yeah.
cool. Good deal. So, but even for your mentors who are mental health professionals, they're not signed up to be therapists with you. They're signed up to be mentors, right? So there's that idea about sort of scope of practice where we're not expecting you to be therapists, but we do want you to understand that your youth may travel back and forth on this continuum. So you might have a young person and you might be noticing some signs and symptoms of depression. What would those be? How would you know? Think about, either friends or family or people that you've known that have had depression or you yourself. What are some of the signs and symptoms?
Withdrawn.
More withdrawn, good.
Spurts of anger.
Lethargic. Some anger, yeah, it doesn't all have to be like, right? Depression can also be sort of more externalized. What else?
Loss of interest.
Good. Loss of, yeah.
Not showing up when there's.
Yeah, so if you have a kid that just is sort of really checked out and disengaged, could be a red flag, right, that something's going on. What would some of the really obvious things be around, someone struggling with depression?
Self-harm.
Self-harm, good. The more behavioral things, suicidal ideation. Yeah. So if you saw this, right, then you would want to get that young person help and support, right? A lot of these conversations with your youth begin with the fact that you are mandated reporters, okay? You all know that. You'll cover that, I'm sure, with sort of the Explore Austin policies. But if you ever find out, right, that a young person is at risk of harming themselves or harming someone else or are experiencing any kind of abuse or neglect So your youth should know that. You should, I'm sure you have language for talking about that. But in that spirit, when we talk about being mandated reporters, it sounds so scary. It's really just like, hey, you know what my biggest concern is as your mentor? Always. My biggest concern, all the time, 100%, is your physical and emotional safety and well-being. That's what I care about the most. The most. Beyond your grades, beyond this, that. Are you doing okay? And so when we frame how do we have these conversations with youth, we frame it around our care. Not our savior complex. Not like, I want to fix you or make everything better, but I want to walk alongside of you when you struggle and make sure that you're safe. That's the most important thing. And to normalize that there is no shame in the struggle. That's like a little mantra that I hold on to. Because if you normalize that, and you can, appropriate self-disclosure, you're not going to break down in front of your kids. But if you yourself are struggling with something, it's okay to be like, yeah, you know what? I'm working through some stuff in my family right now. Yeah, and I'm talking to people about it, and I'm getting support. That's role modeling being a healthy human, and they need to see that, right? So, framing it from a place of care and knowing that even though you're working with them on this end of the continuum, you might need to get them the help and assistance that they need to move into more of a treatment place in this continuum. All right, can someone tell me what time it is?
11:30.
Whoops. Okay. 11:30. Okay, we're doing good. So, scope of practice. What does this mean when you hear this term?
What falls within your sort of role.
Right. Like, I'm not going to, perform brain surgery. It might be kind of fun, but I don't know. Not really competent as a clinical social worker, not really trained. So, this is just our reminder again and it sort of takes the pressure off. Y'all are not meant to be therapists, right? That is not what you need to do. But all of you need to be able to have loving social and emotional conversations with each other and with your young people. So we're going to get into what that can look like, and gosh, maybe even get to practice. We'll see. So who can be therapists? Who are the people that can actually move into the intervention part of that continuum, right? Primary care physicians, a lot of times we're seeing much more involvement around assessing for trauma and mental health. Obviously, licensed mental health professionals like you've got here in the room. Certified peer specialists. There's a real movement right now in mental health recovery to bring in certified peer specialists. And those are people who themselves have had a mental health diagnosis and are at a level of recovery and have training to sort of be there and be like, I get it, I walked in your shoes. We see this model used a lot in substance abuse treatment, right? People who themselves have struggled with addiction and are now in recovery and can help others that are sort of walking on that journey.
Working on it.
We don't know.
So we want to make sure that you all stay within your scope of practice, right? So let me ask you a question while we're figuring out technical difficulties. What kinds of issues might you anticipate coming up with your youth that sort of make you uncomfortable? Like, I don't know what I would do if. We gotta be vulnerable here. Okay.
Eating disorder.
Okay, so someone struggling with an eating disorder. And can you say more about a little bit why that would be a tough issue to sort of deal with?
Well, because I think it's hard to, encourage someone to be healthy and give them guidance while not being, offensive to them or distancing them in some way or
Yeah.
a level of trust.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one because you want to make sure the person's safe, but you also don't want to step into a role of control
Right.
or shaming,
Right.
because those are two of the primary issues that drive a person's eating disorder.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like the need for control and a sense of shame. And so I think that is a larger question is how do we have curious conversations about hey, so tell me more about that and what help are you getting? And yeah, and can we all sort of identify with maybe having a complex relationship with food or our bodies? Probably almost everyone in this room, right? And so we can normalize that part of it and just sort of say, yeah, like I want you to get the help that you need, professionally, just to make sure you're really safe. But also, like, I'm great. Like, if you want to talk about it, I understand what it's like to sort of struggle with how you see yourself and what food means to you and all that. So if you ever want to talk about it, that's great, But it doesn't have to, you're not stepping into that role of being like, did you eat your granola bar today? We got to make sure you ate your granola bar, right? Because then that's going to put you in a terrible place, and it's going to really create some tension in that relationship. Good, thank you. What else? What other issues?
So I just want to follow up question. Like, what if they're not sharing with you? You just rejected it.
Yeah.
Because you can't really say, tell me more about it if they haven't really said it.
Sure. So here's one of the things that I think even non-clinical folks can do, and that is to be a mirror, okay? A loving, non-judgmental mirror, which is to say, around any issue, I'm noticing that, or it seems like sometimes when we're together, or I'm wondering if, and that is just based on what you're observing in the young person, and presenting that really, really gently and with a lot of humility, and also normalizing, right? So I'm noticing that whenever we go on our expeditions, that you're pretty tired and it doesn't seem like you're really giving your body the fuel that it needs. I'm wondering if that's something that you're struggling with right now. Can you tell me more about that? Right? I go in my therapist voice. Everyone has to work on their therapist voice. Like, do you hear how that's really like open-ended, and it's just that mirroring back? I'm just seeing something, I'm noticing something. I'm not going to make an assumption. I'm not going to diagnose you, but I do sort of want to open up the conversation with you. Can we just open up the conversation a little bit about that? And poco a poco, right? Like you're not like cracking people open here. It's not open heart surgery. Yeah.
How does that relate to you have that mirroring conversation and then they disclose something?
Yeah.
That feeling like I'm mirroring and I want them to tell me that now I have to report.
Yeah.
That kind of feels kind of this tension.
So your young people should know that, right? And so ahead of time, that should be framed, that should be a conversation that you've had with them so that they know that. But even so, let's say at the beginning of the year, you had a conversation with the young people, like, hey, as your mentor, if ever I have any, thoughts that maybe you're not safe, I need to tell somebody, right? Okay. So let's say that conversation takes place at the beginning of the year, and then you're on an expedition somewhere, it's 8 months later. It's not maybe in the forefront of their mind. So, two things. One, if you're thinking I need to have this mirroring conversation, you might say, hey, remember when we talked at the beginning of the year about how your safety and your well-being is the most important thing for me? And that if I feel like you're not safe, that I need to tell someone, I'm having some concerns about this. And so you remind them, and then you do the mirroring conversation so that they're fully informed and that they know. Or sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes you're already in a conversation with a young person and they tell you something and then you go, oh, shit, I've got to report this. It's okay. You just go back to that young person and you say, hey, I want to circle back around to that conversation that we had, because you disclosed that, you're not feeling safe in your home, and I really appreciate you trusting me enough to open up to me about that. And I just want to remind you of our conversation that as your mentor, your safety is the most important thing, and this is something that I'm going to have to tell the staff about, and just get you some help and support, right? And then you have great staff that can also help walk you through that process. There are policies in place that Explore Austin has if you need to report abuse, neglect, self-harm, all of that. But that's how I would frame it. Always coming back to this is about me caring for you and your safety. That's the most important thing. And it's okay if you're pissed off at me. I understand that. It feels really scary to have someone sort of feel like I'm all up in your business, and yet I know that you can get through this hard time, and it's important that you get the support you need to do that. There's tough conversations, but it's okay. It's okay. They won't be mad at you forever, And ignoring it is also not job is to respond, assess, and refer. So let's talk about that. How many of you have done, can you click it for me? I don't know what's happening.
Yep.
Thanks. I'll just do air clip. How many have done the mental health first aid training? Anyone done mental health first aid? Okay, so just a little bit of background. Mental health first aid, so I have been trained in mental health first aid, psychological first aid, which is through more of a disaster response model, and then also a model called the clinical first responder, which is more specifically for outdoor, non-clinical outdoor professionals. And so I got hired by the Student Conservation Association to take all three of those models and sort of do like a content analysis. Like what are the basic skills that a non-clinical person needs to have, okay, in order to respond, assess, and refer, right? And so basically, the very first thing you need to do is just listen non-judgmentally. That is a fundamental skill of all of these trainings, okay? And I won't read these PowerPoints. I believe you all have the PowerPoint. I don't think we have time, nor would you like me to just read the PowerPoint. So take a look at what that means. If we had more time in a training, what I would do is we would be practicing all of these skills with one another, right? What does it feel like to listen non-judgmentally? What does it feel like to listen? Really being a good listener is your number one tool as a mentor, okay? And again, key things, avoid asking too many questions, right? Don't give advice. Pick up on nonverbal cues. So a kid might go, I'm fine. And you might, as that loving, non-judgmental mirror, say, I hear you saying that you're fine. On one hand, I hear you wanting me to believe that you're fine. And on the other hand, I'm seeing your body language, I'm hearing your tone, and it feels like you're not fine. What's up? You know? And say to them, hey, if I'm not the person that you want to talk to about what's really up, that is okay. It is not, you're not entitled to their trust. You're not entitled to a relationship. You gotta work for that. But you are trained to help them know when they need to ask for help, right? This is part of what I'm trying to get you to see. So if you notice that, if they're not ready to talk to you, mirror that back and just say, you know, I can see that right now I'm not the person that you want to talk to about this, and that is okay. But I really hope, and I want to plant the seed for you to make sure you are talking to someone about it. Maybe that's a school counselor, maybe that's a sibling, maybe it's your mom or dad, right? So that's important. Listen, affirm, and validate, right? We all just want to be okay. Am I going crazy? No, you're not going crazy. You're just having a hard time. Okay, that's validation, right? That's so important. It makes people feel so much better. Give reassurance, right? Part of what you want to do when someone is having a hard time is create a context of hope. So just give some basic reassurance. Respect their autonomy, but also if they are in danger, you got to get them help, right? Acknowledge the struggle. They're not weak, lazy, or selfish, right? There's no shame in the struggle. Keep that mantra. Also, if the person is in crisis, right? Breaking down, crying, self-harming, anything like that, you don't leave them. It seems like a really basic thing to say. But you stay with them until you can get them the help that they need, right? And again, so many of these, like the details of what happens next, I'm really going to defer to Explore Austin and their staff and their policies. These are just basic first response skills in life, right? But they have their policies as well. Encourage self-help and other support strategies, right? So part of this is like getting people to buy into their own process of healing. Like, what is it that you need to do to get the help that you need? Who is it that you can talk to, right? What things, have you ever felt this way before? What things have worked for you? Are there any kind of coping skills that you have that you've utilized before that work for you? I worked for Outward Bound for 10 summers, and I had a girl who had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and she was really in sort of a very manic phase and raging, and we had a big, like a 20-mile paddle day, and we had to get across this big-ass lake, and there was a headwind, and I was like, oh my God, like, this is really not good timing, you know? But I said to her, I was like, look, you're not in a good place. Logistically, we're not in a good place as a group. We got to put in some miles. We got to get across this lake before in the boundary waters. The winds pick up, like in a lot of places in the afternoon. So you want to paddle early. And I was like, well, what is it that you need right now in order to fully contribute? Because we need you to paddle. We need you to help get us to that campsite. And she said, well, my therapist said that when I'm like this, I need to journal. And I'm like, and it's like, whoosh, and we do have journals on Outward Bound, we do. And I was like, okay. I said, here's the thing. We have one boat that has the duffer. So there's one of the boats has 3 people. And I said, you can be the duffer. Get out your journal. I'm going to set the timer for 15, 20 minutes for you to journal. We're going to leave you alone. You just hunker down and write. And I said, when that timer goes off, respectfully, I'm going to ask you to pick up a paddle and get back in the game, And she did. It was wild. Because she got to use a coping skill that had already worked for her, right? And I was respectful of that as much as I could be, given that we had a headwind and we really needed her to paddle. But that's the other thing too, like being needed, being saying, yeah, I get that you're struggling and you're still a vital member of this community and we need you. What happens to people when they have mental illness? Are they integrated into the community in Western mental health? No. We lock them up. We push them aside. They live under a bridge. I mean, I'm not saying that literally. We isolate people with mental health instead of saying, we need you. We want you as vibrant members of this community. So that's our goal, is full contribution, right? Okay. One of the things, did I skip? Oops. Yeah, so again, the last step, right, is encourage appropriate professional help. If they actually, beyond just needing a support system, if they really do need professional help, normalize that. It's okay to talk to a therapist. It might even be good. Like, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to tell you what you need, but sometimes people even go to a psychiatrist and they see if maybe there's medication that can help them feel better. That's all up to you and your family, but just normalizing that sometimes you might need to take it that next step, right? If my arm is broken, there's only so much like wearing a sling, or whatever tiny little way of dealing with it I can. So if I have to go in and get a cast, and that's pretty obvious, and then everyone says, what's wrong, or what happened, right? And so that's the other thing I want to point out. It's like with a physical illness or a physical disability, if someone walked into the room and their leg was broken, right, we would immediately ask what question? What happened, right? But with mental illness, we ask the question, what the hell's wrong with you? What's wrong with that person? We should still be asking the question, what happened? That's a trauma-informed perspective. It's just, again, understanding that the things that folks have been through in their lives and this complex combination of nature and nurture, right, can create vulnerability. But it can also create opportunities for resilience and healing. And that's what we're doing. That's why we're here together, right? So I would say that in the moment, probably the most important skills that you all need would be de-escalation skills. Now, when you hear the word de-escalation, you might think like you're dealing with someone that's angry. I don't mean that. You might be, right? A youth might be just popping off and just really, really pissed off. Or it just might be a kid that's like sobbing. Or it might be a kid that's like disengaged or walking away from the group. I mean, it could look a lot of ways. But regardless of the issue, if you can practice some of these skills with your groups, that will be really powerful. So what we know is that our central nervous system reacts to other people's central nervous system. So what do you notice I'm doing right now with my voice? The tone is a little bit lower. I'm speaking more slowly. Right? Some of you might be like, that's going to drive me crazy. But what I want you to know is that when you approach someone who's really, really amped, it can help calm them for you to stay calm. So your greatest tool is yourself. And you have to ask yourself, wow, how self-regulated am I? I'm not a very self-regulated person. I'm pretty like, woo! I'm like Fred and Noel. I'm pretty up, right? And that's a strength in a lot of situations. But as a clinical social worker, when I had to do crisis intervention, like I am not the girl you want in the ER or like at the police station at 3 o'clock in the morning. Like I don't So it's sort of knowing your own tolerance for other people's chaos, right? And how regulated can you stay in that moment? And the process is also about co-regulation, because I know y'all do a lot of your work in groups. So if you're struggling to stay calm, if a youth is not calm, get some help from another mentor, from a staff member, from a trip leader. Acknowledge what you're feeling, like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. Right, that's okay. And what is one of our greatest tools? Man, oh, I feel better. Right? Is so grounding to just plant those 2 feet, take a big deep breath in and out, and you can do that with your youth. You don't have to be a clinician to say, hey, you know what, this is a stressful situation. Why don't we take a deep breath in and out together? And you do it. You role model that. It's going to help you feel better. So staying calm, speaking slowly and confidently with a gentle, caring tone of voice. Do not argue or respond in a hostile, threatening, disciplinary, or challenging manner. It's just not your role. Now, could a kid is there maybe a teachable moment happening if there's a behavioral issue that's going on? Possibly, but not in that moment. When you are out of your resilience zone, let's call it, right? When your nervous system, we have our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic. So either you're freaking out or shut down. Those are the 2 extremes. In the middle of those extremes is what we call our resilience zone. That's where we want to be. What we need to acknowledge, though, is that when we do outdoor adventure-based programming, sometimes we can bump people out of their resilience zone because they're in a space of physical challenge, right? When you're rock climbing, my central nervous system is like, what's happening? So there's a lot of opportunities for grounding and deep breathing, but when I'm out of my resilience zone, there is only one thing I need to do, and that's get back in it, right? Get back in it. So, and you can use all kinds of tools for this, like red, green, and yellow, like a stoplight. We want to be green, right? We want to be in that green zone. What does it mean if we're getting a little bit yellow? And we don't want to be in the red zone, right? The red zone is when we're not able to think clearly, we're not able to empathize, we're not able to problem solve, we're not able to stay self-regulated. So you're a role model. Avoid raising your voice or talking too fast. Using really positive, reassuring words like you're safe, it's okay, breathe with me. Let's get grounded together. Let's just stay calm together, right? That kind of stuff is really, really regulating for people in crisis. If possible, try not to restrict someone's movement. Walking is the greatest thing ever. If you have a kid that's really upset, just be like, yeah, let's walk together. When someone's really, really upset, it's hard to just be still. And that's actually the body, right? We have issues in our tissues. The body needs to release, just like an animal. There's been all this research when animals, like a deer runs across the street and almost gets hit by your truck, they just shake it off from the other side of the road and they can move on. They can shake off that trauma. There's a physical release of that trauma. As humans, we need that same thing. You're already at an advantage with that because you're engaging in outdoor activities that are really kinesthetic, right? So you already have an advantage. Again, if you ever were in a situation where you had a major crisis and you needed to engage outside staff or law enforcement or outside mental health professionals, just being aware, obviously, that could exacerbate the person's situation and their mood. And the other thing is just also knowing that you don't have to be having a conversation. If a young person is really, really upset, sometimes you can just come and just say, I'm gonna sit over here with you right now. Is that okay? And they might, and you can say, it's okay. I'm not even gonna say anything. I'm just gonna sit here with you and just make sure that you're safe. Okay? And take the pressure off of having a growth-oriented conversation. Just let them get back in their resilience zone, right? And then that's the great thing. I love this program. I love that y'all are committing to being in a young person's life over the course of some major developmental years. But that is such an advantage because you can slow play some of this stuff, right? Not everything has to be an intervention. It's just relationship building. And you can be like, remember that trip we went on like last year? And you got really upset. It's funny because I was thinking about that. This year, it's like you face some of the same challenges and yet you handle it so differently. That's cool. Did you notice that? What do you think about that? Right? And so you get to, again, we're not just mirroring back, right? The concerns we have, we should also be mirroring back those strengths and that growth. So they can chew on that. They can hold on to that. So de-escalation skills, and then can someone give me a time check?
11.
Oh, wow. Okay. So some final thoughts. Mental health recovery. I don't think we talk about it enough. We talk about mental health treatment all the time. But I think it's really great for young people to have role models of people who have mental health disorders and thrive in society. And I mean, you can look Google this, all these famous people that are like, I have this, and I have this, and I struggle with this. And you yourself, again, might be a person with a mental health diagnosis who's thriving, who's contributing, right? And for young people to have those role models is really, really important. And because it focuses on recovery. It says you can be a fully contributing member of this community and still have vulnerability around your mental health. That is okay. That helps reduce stigma. And I think even doing a training like this and giving you all just like maybe some basic little tools to listen, affirm, and validate and learn how to sort of use yourself to de-escalate when you've been crisis. Even those little things help reduce that stigma, right? Because if a kid is struggling, you're not hopefully feeling like I have to fix this. And this is this new mantra in my life right now. Actually, point of real personal sharing. My aunt actually tried to kill herself in the fall. And I'm very, very close to my aunt. It's my mom's sister. And it sort of threw our whole family into a tailspin. And my mom, I couldn't go visit my aunt. I actually had some work obligations. I went and saw her just about a week ago, which was great. But really, I wasn't there. My mom went when she was still in the hospital, and it was still real messy. And my mom's not a mental health professional. And she was like, Chris, what am I supposed to do? I can't fix this. I cannot fix this. This is too big. I mean, it was a really bad situation. And I said, Mom, you're right. You cannot fix this. That is not your role. And I said, but you can leave the situation better than you found it. And I would offer that to you all. You might encounter some messiness in the lives of your young people, that you're working with, your mentees, right? You might encounter some chaos in their communities or chaos in their families. You might encounter some chaos in their lives in their schools. But it's not your job to fix it. It's your job to leave it a little bit better. And part of the way you leave it a little bit better is just by being you, right? Just by being engaged, just by being committed and caring and walking alongside of that youth. It takes a lot of courage to be a mentor, y'all, because you sit with people in their struggle. You just commit to that. You're like, I'm with you. We're gonna go through a lot in this time. Y'all remember like 6th grade to 12th grade. There's a lot that happens, right? And you're just sort of saying, I'm gonna be with you through that. Can't fix it. I don't carry a magic wand, but I have the relational courage to be with you, even if you struggle with things like mental health, right? So that is just beautiful. Now, the other thing I want to say is when y'all do this work, you have to think about yourselves and your own self-care and your own burnout and the vicarious trauma. That's a whole separate training, am I right? It's very real. You can start feeling this. So please know what your own red flags are when you start feeling challenged, right, by some of the stories that you're experiencing and the situations you're experiencing with your young person, and get the support that you need. My experience with Explore Austin is that this is a really open and affirming group of staff who really care about mentors' well-being. So if you yourself notice the stress and struggle of working with young people that might be struggling, please reach out to the staff and ask for help. Don't just suffer silently, okay? And then also just remember your scope of practice. We're giving you a little taste of like mental health awareness and knowledge and a little bit of skill building, but you're not expected to be a therapist. You don't have to go at it alone, right? There are obviously a lot of big burning questions still, and maybe this presentation brought up even more. And like I said, I'm certainly happy to come back, but just remember that you're not therapists, you're mentors, and as such, you have the support of the staff to help you in that role. So, maybe a couple questions. Would we have time for that, James? Okay. Woo, that was fast.
That's awesome.
So I totally get the calming down in a situation, you know,
Yeah.
taking time to breathe. But is it, to me, I could see a coping mechanism to just be like, okay, this is a stressful environment. Like, you feel like screaming, let's just take 2 seconds to
Totally.
scream as loud as you want.
Yeah.
And then we're gonna like get back to,
Yeah.
challenge or whatever.
It's meeting the young person where they are. I mean, you know, there are people that if you said, "Can you breathe with me?" they would like punch you in the face.
Yeah, right.
But the other thing is this. The other thing is you mirroring and matching are two really important skills. So, like, I think about my 9-year-old the other day. She was really pissed off at her 4th grade teacher, and she came home. She's like, "Man, Mr. White," and I was like, "What did he do? Tell me what he did. What happened?" You know, and I matched her because then she kept going. You know, but then I regulated, right? So initially, it's okay to sometimes be like, "Yeah, that does seem unfair. She seemed mad," right? Like, and that's their body language and their tone. But then I'm gonna go, "What do you think he could have meant by that?" Or, "Oh, what do you think?" And then I'm calming, and then I'm re-engaging her prefrontal cortex, which has been hijacked because she's so pissed. Right? But you're right. Initially, sometimes it's like, "Yeah, you seem mad. Like, let's just get that out." It doesn't all have to be like Zen, kumbaya. Totally. Good question.
It's really not a question more than a request, which is just as someone who's been a mentor, I think what you're describing, I would encourage you, and you can help validate or disprove this. Your explorers they're gonna call you out when you're stressed. And the ability to mirror, because they're gonna say, it seems like something's up with you. So it's really
I
just more
agree.
of a
I agree. I think this is a reciprocal relationship, and young people are bullshit detectors. And it's awesome. They're awesome. I mean, I love them for that very reason. My husband's a high school teacher. I've been a social worker with high-risk youth my whole career, and now we have 3 kids, like 2 teenagers and a 9-year-old. So there is no faking it. You know, it's very rare. But what I would say is be prepared for that, and be prepared for authentic sharing with healthy boundaries. So you can say, "Yeah, you know what? Work is really stressful right now. You know, sometimes you feel like you just have so much coming at you all at once. It's sort of where I'm at." And then the kid goes, "Yeah, really? You feel that way too?" And now you're in this relationship building conversation versus, you know, you oversharing. But you were authentic, right? So just be prepared for that. I think that's a really good point.
We're just saying, don't bug me, because I've seen that too.
Yeah, well, and what effect does that have on the relationship? And that feels really unfair from like a power dynamic because you're asking them to open up and be vulnerable with you to some extent, right? And then if you're just like, we're not here to talk about me, I'm the mentor. Now they're like, okay. So yeah, I would say authentic sharing with healthy boundaries. It's a great question. One more question or thought.
It's more like a practical curiosity
Sure.
question, but like, and I don't know if you know this or if they need to answer. I don't. But like you report something, right? So I'm assuming as mentors, who technically would report that?
Yeah, what's your protocol? And then I can
James,
say
Yeah.
a little
And
bit
then
about
what actually happens after? I'd be curious, like, to understand what's going to happen so that I can myself be prepared. Like,
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, somewhat to Dr. Norton's point earlier, I mean, it's not uncommon for us to have like 2 or sometimes 3 cases a year that we're reporting, typically to CPS. And CPS
Child
is,
Protective Services.
yeah,
Mhm.
their
So don't know.
general request has been to hear it directly from the person that heard it from the youth. But sometimes they've let us do the report to them. And typically they like it over the phone. It's kind of been their preference. And they'll generally give us some follow-up or feedback afterwards if we kind of request that they keep in touch around that. So we're happy to be on the phone with you. We're happy to just have you make the call. They've let us make the call for the mentor.
And the hard thing is like, so if you say, yeah, I'm going to need to tell someone because I got to make sure you're safe, right? The kid might go, well, who are you going to tell? So you can say, well, I'm probably going to report this to staff, right? Because we're youth in the community know that child protective services exist. And if they immediately flip out about that, it's probably because they've had some bad experiences or they've seen some bad things happen in their communities around CPS or police involvement, in which case you can say something like, you know what, I get it, it's not a perfect system, it's pretty stressful, and yet it is the system that we have in place to make sure that kids are safe. And no matter what that ends up looking like, I'm going to be here with you through that, right? That's all you can do. I mean, there are amazing CPS workers. I run a program at Texas State called FACES, which is Foster Care Alumni Creating Educational Success. And I have kids that are like, CPS saved my life. And then I also have kids that are like, ooh, they screw things up even more. And it's just like school, public school. You get really great teachers, and then you have some that are like, so, yeah.
I was gonna say I unfortunately have to make CPS reports all the time.
Well, you have a resource here.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions.
Like, would it still be CPS if
Like-
it was like an eating disorder or like suicidal thoughts, right? Is that still CPS or is it?
We're doing a hour-long session right after lunch on abuse, neglect, self-harm, prevention, and reporting.
Boom!
So we can save some of these. A lot of these will be answered. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, one more, and then we'll wrap up because you guys gotta go eat.
How does that, like, the reporting, is there like a follow-up relationship with the afterwards, or how is that?
I would say really case by case, but typically I would say that the relationship has
Well, that's one of the nice things about being in the role of mentor.
Right.
You're not directly connected just to their school or to their family. I mean, as long as they're in the community, theoretically, you can still be in a mentoring role. Thank you all so much. Thanks to Explore Austin. I love this program, and I got a lot on my plate, but someday I'll come back and maybe be a mentor.